The Heresy Pyre, when God speaks through the humble. History's most feared revolutionaries weren't kings or generals. They were ordinary people who claimed to hear God's voice. And when the divine speaks through the humble, empires tremble. Today I want to tell you about the most dangerous words ever spoken to power. Thus says the Lord through his servant. Because every time someone without wealth, education, or noble blood has dared to claim divine authority, the response has been swift and brutal. The stake, the sword, the cross. The powerful have learned that nothing threatens their reign more than a peasant who refuses to bow, because they answer to a higher king. From the hills of Judea to the villages of medieval Europe, from the slave quarters of the American South to the factories of industrial England, the same pattern repeats. God's voice emerges from the most unexpected places: the mouths of fishermen, the visions of teenage girls, the dreams of enslaved prophets, the sermons of unlettered preachers. And every single time, those who claim earthly authority declare these voices heretical, dangerous, worthy of death. But here's what the powerful have never understood. You cannot burn a voice that comes from beyond this world. You can silence the messenger, but the message echoes through eternity. You can break the body, but you cannot touch the soul that has heard the Almighty speak, and that terrifies them more than any army ever could. The story I'm going to tell you today isn't just about religious persecution or medieval superstition. It's about the most dangerous thing in human history. The moment when ordinary people discover they don't need permission from earthly authorities to speak truth to power. It's about what happens when someone realizes that the God of the universe might just choose to work through the least, the lost, and the forgotten. Throughout history, divine revelation has followed a pattern that seems almost designed to offend human sensibilities. God doesn't speak through the expected channels: the priests trained in seminaries, the scholars with theological degrees, the nobles with royal blood. Instead, the Almighty has consistently chosen the most unlikely messengers imaginable. Shepherds receive angelic announcements. Teenage girls become mothers of saviors. Fishermen become apostles. Former persecutors become evangelists. This pattern isn't accidental, it's revolutionary. When God chooses the humble to carry divine messages, it upends every human power structure. It says that education doesn't qualify you to speak for heaven. Wealth doesn't buy you divine favor. Noble birth doesn't make you more worthy of revelation. In fact, these very advantages might actually disqualify you from hearing heaven's voice, because they make you too comfortable with the world as it is. Consider the prophets of ancient Israel. Isaiah was a court prophet, comfortable with power, until God's vision stripped him of his pretensions and sent him with messages the powerful didn't want to hear. Jeremiah wept because he knew the cost of speaking divine truth to earthly authorities. Ezekiel performed bizarre acts that made him seem like a madman to his contemporaries. Amos was just a shepherd and farmer who dared to pronounce judgment on the wealthy elite. Again and again, God's voice came through people who had no business, by human standards, claiming divine authority. But this is precisely the point. When heaven speaks through the humble, it demonstrates that divine truth doesn't depend on human credentials. It shows that God's kingdom operates by completely different rules than earthly kingdoms. It proves that the last shall be first, the meek shall inherit the earth, and the powerful shall be brought low. And that's exactly why the establishment always responds with violence. The medieval period offers us some of the most dramatic examples of God's voice emerging from the most unlikely sources, threatening the most established powers. Take Marguerite Porete, a French mystic who wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls in the early 14th century. She was a simple beguine, a laywoman devoted to God, but not bound by convent rules. Her crime? She claimed that the soul could achieve such unity with God that it transcended the need for traditional church mediation. Pyre's mystical writings suggested that someone could become so close to God that they no longer needed priests, sacraments, or even the institutional church itself to access divine truth. You can imagine how well that went over with the ecclesiastical hierarchy. She was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake in 1310, her book publicly destroyed. But here's what the authorities didn't understand. You cannot burn an idea whose time has come. Pyre's writings survived, copied in secret, spreading the dangerous notion that ordinary believers could have direct access to divine truth. Then there's Meister Eckhart, a German mystic whose sermons in the vernacular language reached common people with the radical message that they could experience God directly, without institutional intermediaries. His teachings about the ground of the soul and divine union were so threatening to church authority that he was posthumously condemned as a heretic. The crime: teaching that God was accessible to everyone, not just to those with proper ecclesiastical credentials. But perhaps the most dramatic example is the wave of female mystics who emerged across medieval Europe. Hildegard of Bingen, Mechthild of Magdeburg, Catherine of Siena, Julian of Norwich. These women, many from humble backgrounds, claimed direct revelations from God. They wrote theological treatises, advised popes and kings, and proclaimed divine messages that often contradicted official church teaching. The establishment couldn't entirely silence them because their spiritual authority was too obviously authentic, their influence too widespread. But they watched nervously as these unlettered women demonstrated that God's voice could emerge from the most unexpected places. What made these mystics so dangerous wasn't their theology, it was their authority. When someone claims to speak for God, they're claiming an authority higher than any earthly power. Kings rule by divine right, they say. But what happens when God speaks directly to the peasant in the field, contradicting the king's commands? Popes claim apostolic succession. But what happens when an unlettered woman receives visions that challenge papal teaching? This is the burning question that has plagued every power structure throughout history. What do you do when someone claims divine authorization for rebellion against your rule? You cannot debate with someone who says, "God told me." You cannot negotiate with someone who believes they're carrying out heaven's direct commands. Your only options are to accept their authority, which means abdicating your own, or to destroy them utterly. The medieval church developed sophisticated theological arguments for why private revelations should be subject to ecclesiastical oversight. They created elaborate procedures for testing mystics, examining their visions, validating their experiences. But beneath all this theological sophistication lay a simple political truth. They could not allow the dangerous precedent of ordinary people claiming direct access to divine authority. Because once you accept that God can speak directly to anyone, anywhere, anytime, the entire structure of mediated authority collapses. If the peasant woman can receive revelations as authentic as those of the Pope, what need is there for papal authority? If the unlettered craftsman can hear God's voice as clearly as the learned theologian, what justifies the theologian's privileged position? If divine truth can emerge from the humblest sources, what claim does the earthly hierarchy have to exclusive interpretation of God's will? Perhaps nowhere is this dynamic more clearly visible than in the religious movements that emerged from slavery in the American South. Here we see the most powerless people in society, those literally owned by other human beings, claiming direct revelation from the God of liberation. And their oppressor's response reveals everything about why the humble hearing God's voice is so threatening to established power. Enslaved people created a vibrant spiritual culture centered on direct divine encounter. In the hush harbors, secret gathering places hidden from masters' eyes, they experienced visions, prophetic dreams, and divine callings that directly contradicted everything their oppressors told them about God's will. White Christianity preached that God ordained slavery, that submission was a Christian duty, that their suffering was divinely appointed. But in their secret meetings, enslaved believers heard a different message. Let my people go. Figures like Nat Turner claimed divine visions that called them to violent resistance against slavery. Turner's rebellion in 1831 was sparked by what he believed were direct revelations from God, including solar eclipses and other signs that he interpreted as divine calls to action. The response was swift and brutal, not just Turner's execution, but a wave of violent repression against any enslaved person who might claim divine inspiration for resistance. But the authorities couldn't stop the spread of this dangerous theology. Harriet Tubman, an illiterate enslaved woman, claimed divine visions that guided her work on the Underground Railroad. She said God spoke to her directly, showing her safe paths, warning her of dangers, calling her to risk her life repeatedly to lead others to freedom. Her white contemporaries might dismiss her as delusional, but the enslaved community recognized authentic divine authority when they saw it. The pattern continued as society modernized. During the Industrial Revolution, as factories created new forms of human misery and exploitation, God's voice emerged among the working poor with messages the wealthy industrialists definitely didn't want to hear. Consider the Welsh revival of 1904 to 1905, sparked by Evan Roberts, a young coal miner with minimal formal education who claimed direct revelations from God calling for national spiritual awakening. Roberts' revival meetings were characterized by spontaneous divine encounters, ordinary working people claiming visions, prophetic words, and divine callings that bypassed all traditional religious authority. The established churches watched nervously as these uncontrolled spiritual experiences spread like wildfire among the laboring classes. Here was Christianity that didn't require seminary training, didn't need ecclesiastical approval, didn't submit to institutional oversight. It was dangerous precisely because it was authentic. Similar movements emerged across the industrializing world. In Korea, the Great Revival of 1907 was led by ordinary believers who claimed direct divine encounters. In India, spiritual awakenings among the poor and marginalized challenged both traditional Hindu hierarchies and British colonial Christianity. In Africa, indigenous Christian movements claimed divine revelations that called for independence from European missionary control. Again and again, the pattern repeated, God's voice emerging from the margins, threatening the center. This dynamic hasn't disappeared with modernity. It has only taken new forms. Consider the liberation theology movement in Latin America, where Catholic priests and lay people in impoverished communities claimed that God was calling them to work for social justice and political change. Their crime? Suggesting that the gospel had implications for economic systems and political structures. Many paid with their lives. Archbishop Oscar Romero, gunned down while celebrating Mass. The Jesuit priests of El Salvador, murdered for their work with the poor. Countless others who died for claiming that God's voice could emerge from the favelas and villages. Or look at the civil rights movement in the United States, where African-American preachers like Martin Luther King Jr. claimed divine authority for their challenge to racial segregation. King's letter from Birmingham jail is essentially a defense of hearing God's voice outside established religious authority. He argued that divine law superseded human law, that God's calling to justice overrode church concerns about proper timing and appropriate methods. The response from white religious leaders was telling. They didn't deny King's theological competence or question his Christian faith. They questioned his authority, his right to claim divine endorsement for civil disobedience. His presumption in believing God was calling him to challenge established social order. Once again, the issue wasn't theology but authority. Who has the right to speak for God? Throughout history, those who claim to hear God's voice face a terrible choice: remain silent and deny their calling, or speak truth and face the consequences. The consequences are always severe because earthly powers understand instinctively that divine authority threatens their own. They respond with the only weapons they have: violence, ridicule, marginalization, and ultimately death. But here's what they never seem to learn. Martyrdom validates the very authority they're trying to destroy. When you kill someone for claiming to speak for God, you force the world to take their claim seriously. Stephen's stoning didn't silence the early Christian movement, it spread it. Joan of Arc's execution didn't end her influence, it made her a saint. The burning of Marguerite Porete didn't stop mystical spirituality, it drove it underground where it grew stronger. The powerful make the same mistake repeatedly. They think they can solve the problem of divine authority by eliminating the human vessels through which it flows. But they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of authentic spiritual authority. It doesn't depend on the messenger, it comes through the messenger. Destroy the prophet, and God raises up another. Silence the mystic, and the divine voice finds a new throat. Burn the heretic, and the truth they died for becomes immortal. Today, this ancient pattern continues in new forms. Around the world, ordinary believers in oppressive situations claim divine callings that challenge established powers. In China, house church leaders face imprisonment for claiming religious authority outside state-approved channels. In Iran, converts to Christianity risk death for claiming God's voice called them away from the established religion. In North Korea, underground Christians face execution for believing that divine authority supersedes state authority. But the pattern also appears in less dramatic ways throughout the modern world. Consider the prosperity gospel movement, where preachers from humble backgrounds claim divine revelations about God's desire for believers' material success. Whether you agree with their theology or not, their authority structure follows the ancient pattern. God speaks directly to ordinary people, bypassing traditional religious hierarchies, offering access to divine power without institutional mediation. Or look at the charismatic movement, where speaking in tongues, prophetic words, and divine healings are claimed by believers regardless of their education, social status, or denominational credentials. The established churches watch nervously as these uncontrolled spiritual experiences spread, creating authority structures that don't require seminary degrees or ecclesiastical approval. The reason God's voice through the humble remains threatening to established power is simple. It reveals that earthly authority is temporary, limited, and ultimately insignificant. When someone claims divine revelation, they're saying that there's a higher court of appeal than human institutions. They're suggesting that God's truth might be different from the official version. They're implying that divine calling can override human command. This is why every totalitarian system throughout history has tried to control religious expression. It's not because they fear theology. It's because they fear the authority that authentic spiritual experience can create. Stalin didn't fear the Russian Orthodox Church when it was controlled by the state. He feared the underground believers who claimed direct divine encounters. Hitler didn't fear compliant church leaders. He feared the confessing church members who claimed God was calling them to resist Nazi ideology. The pattern is always the same. Earthly powers can coexist with religion that supports their authority, but they must destroy any spirituality that claims higher authority. They can tolerate God talk that reinforces the status quo, but they cannot allow divine voices that call for transformation. They can accept faith that knows its place, but they must silence any revelation that threatens their position. But here's the beautiful, terrible truth that every oppressive system learns too late. You cannot extinguish a fire that burns in the human soul. You cannot silence a voice that speaks from eternity. You cannot kill an idea whose time has come from heaven itself. The very act of persecution proves the authenticity of what you're trying to destroy. When God speaks through the humble, it starts a fire that no earthly power can quench. It may be driven underground, scattered by persecution, seemingly destroyed by violence, but it burns on in secret places, in hidden gatherings, in the hearts of those who have heard the divine voice for themselves. And eventually, inevitably, it blazes forth again, consuming the very structures that tried to contain it. This is the heresy that terrifies the powerful, the knowledge that God's voice can emerge from anywhere, anytime, through anyone. That divine truth doesn't require human permission. That heavenly authority doesn't need earthly credentials. That the kingdom of God operates by rules that make earthly kingdoms tremble. The stakes are always lit and ready. The authorities are always prepared to burn those who claim to speak for heaven. But the fire of divine truth burns hotter than any human flame. And in the end, it's not the martyrs who are consumed. It's the kingdoms that try to silence them. Every time you hear someone dismissed as crazy for claiming divine revelation, remember this pattern. Every time you see someone persecuted for speaking prophetic truth to power, recognize this ancient dynamic. Every time the establishment moves to silence a voice claiming heavenly authority, understand what's really happening. The eternal struggle between kingdoms, the temporal and the divine. And ask yourself this question: if God still speaks today, would you have the courage to listen? Would you have the faith to believe that the divine voice might choose to speak through you? Would you be willing to pay the price that every prophet, mystic, and seer throughout history has paid for the privilege of carrying heaven's message to earth? The heresy pyre still burns. The question is, will you warm yourself by its light? Or will you help build the stake for the next prophet who dares to say, "Thus says the Lord"? Underscore, 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 underscore. If this exploration of divine authority through history has stirred something in your soul, hit that like button to help others discover these untold stories of faith and resistance. And subscribe to join a community that refuses to let the voices of the humble be forgotten, because sometimes the most powerful truth comes from the most unexpected places. The fire still burns, and the voice still calls. The question is, are you listening?